In June 2026, a new bureaucratic architecture takes effect across Europe, legally binding 27 nations to a single demographic equation. Under this system, any capital that refuses its assigned portion of human arrivals must pay a precise fine, €20,000 per person. Western European nations, facing hundreds of millions of euros in penalties, have signed the document. Yet, one landlocked territory of 10.5 million people, completely surrounded by the enforcement zone, pays nothing, receives no relocations, and faces zero sanctions. The European Commission itself signed the exemption. 10 years ago, this same territory was labelled an outlaw state by every major Western power for refusing a quota of exactly 2,691 people. The inversion of European law did not happen by accident. It was the mathematical result of a calculated structural resistance. To understand the fracture, look at the physical mass of the continent in 2015. 1.3 million asylum seekers crossed the Mediterranean in 12 months, 5 times the volume of the previous year. The collective weight of this migration put pressure on the borders of Italy and Greece, threatening to break the internal transit mechanics of the European Union. The central authority in Brussels reacted by attempting a structural redistribution. In September 2015, the European Council implemented a mandatory relocation scheme to move 120,000 individuals across the bloc using a rigid mathematical formula based on population and gross domestic product. For Germany, which absorbed 890,000 people that year, the formula was an expression of continental solidarity. For Prague, the formula looked like an external vector trying to overwrite domestic infrastructure. The Czech political machinery did not react out of sudden panic, but out of historical memory. For 40 years, the country operated under the administrative mechanics of Soviet domination, where every structural decision was dictated by a foreign capital. When Brussels introduced the binding quota system in late 2015, the population recognized the pattern: a larger centralized authority imposing demographic mandates on a smaller state under the guise of an ideological emergency. This internal consensus was cemented within 60 days. In November 2015, coordinated attacks in Paris killed 130 people, utilizing transit routes that the European Commission was attempting to manage via centralized quotas. The risk was no longer an abstract legal theory. Public opposition in Czechia instantly crossed 70%, transforming a policy decision into an electoral survival mechanism for the entire political class. This resistance was further reinforced by a stark structural divergence from Western Europe. Unlike Britain or France, Czechia possessed no 20th century colonial dependencies, no multi-generational diaspora networks, and no pre-existing urban infrastructure designed to absorb non-European migration. The 2011 national census recorded a population that was almost entirely ethnically homogeneous. While Western capitals viewed rapid demographic alteration as a historical inevitability, Prague viewed it as an unquantifiable systemic risk. By the end of 2016, public rejection of the EU quota system rose to 78%. In comparison, opposition inside Germany and Sweden hovered between 40 and 50%. The political spectrum in Prague unified. Left-wing social democrats, populist movements, and right-wing factions voted as a single legislative wall by the time the initial 2-year relocation mandate expired in 2017. The physical reality of Czech defiance was clear. Out of the 2,691 individuals assigned to Prague by Brussels, the country had admitted exactly 12. This compliance rate of less than 0.5% triggered an immediate structural counterattack. On June 13, 2017, the European Commission initiated formal infringement proceedings against Czechia, Poland, and Hungary. The central authority possessed massive leverage, structural funds that accounted for 3.5% of the Czech gross domestic product. Western media classified the state as a continental pariah, while financial analysts predicted that an economy sending 80% of its exports directly into the single market would collapse under diplomatic isolation. The predicted collapse failed to occur because the economic calculations ignored a regional defensive alliance. Czechia did not stand alone. It operated within the Visegrad Group alongside Poland, Hungary, and Slovakia. Together, this post-communist bloc represented 64 million people and 14% of the total European Union population. In 2015, this quiet coordination mechanism became an active legislative shield. While Hungary absorbed the media hostility and Poland took the direct diplomatic impact, Prague utilized the collective voting weight of the alliance to deflect centralized enforcement. The four governments harmonized their internal security operations and pre-voted every European summit proposal, making it impossible for Brussels to isolate or fracture the regional front. The legal confrontation peaked on April 2, 2020, inside the European Court of Justice. The court issued an absolute verdict. Czechia, Poland and Hungary had explicitly violated European law by rejecting the mandatory migration mechanism. Yet, this absolute legal victory exposed a fundamental flaw in the European architecture. The treaty possessed no automatic enforcement mechanism for financial penalties. Every sanction required prolonged political authorization and negotiation. By the time the court ruled, the physical pressure on the Mediterranean had dropped from over 1 million annual arrivals to 95,000. The crisis that justified the original emergency mandates had evaporated, allowing Prague to simply outlast the bureaucratic cycle without paying a single euro. The systemic inversion became complete on December 8, 2025. During an emergency meeting of interior ministers in Brussels, the central authority finalized the new pact on migration and asylum, engineered specifically to close the legal loopholes of the previous decade. The core of the pact was an annual solidarity pool forcing member states to either accept relocated migrants or pay €20,000 per individual into a central fund. For the 2026 cycle, this meant a collective demand of 21,000 relocations or €420 million in cash. The architecture was designed to finally compel Central European compliance through an inescapable financial trap. When the session concluded, the European Commission announced a total structural exemption for Prague. The justification was purely mathematical. Since February 2022, Czechia had absorbed over 400,000 Ukrainian refugees, with cumulative figures exceeding 500,000. According to Eurostat data, this equated to 35.4 refugees per 1,000 inhabitants, nearly 5 times the European Union average. The small nation that had spent 10 years being lectured about continental solidarity was now carrying the heaviest per capita refugee volume on the continent. The moral leverage shifted instantly. The nations that had spent a decade demanding penalties for Prague were now the ones forced to either accept thousands of relocations or write checks worth hundreds of millions of euros to the central fund. But the exemption did not pacify the politic. Machinery in Prague. It accelerated its defiance. On December 16, 2025, a newly elected hardline coalition, led by Andrej Babiš, held its first cabinet meeting. Backed by a legislative majority representing over 2 million voters, the administration executed a pre-planned structural assault. In a single afternoon, the cabinet passed a formal resolution completely rejecting the entire framework of the EU Migration Pact, alongside the continent's new carbon emissions trading system. The government announced a new national asylum law designed to reduce legal admissions to near zero. The system designed by Brussels to enforce continental uniformity had not only failed to bend Prague, it had triggered a counter-reaction that threatened to dismantle the two structural pillars of the modern European project. The illusion of a centralized consensus was broken, and the real fracture was about to begin. The mechanics of internal collapse began not with a political explosion, but with a digital bottleneck. In June 2026, the activation of the new pact on migration and asylum instantly overloaded Eurodac, the Central European Biometric Database designed to track asylum seekers across 27 countries. The system requires frontier states to log fingerprints and high-resolution facial data within 72 hours of an individual's arrival. In Italy and Greece, where maritime arrivals spiked by 42% in the first 4 months of 2026, local processing units faced an immediate backlog of 98,000 unprocessed profiles. The technology failed to handle the volume. Because the database lacked these central entries, the automated relocation algorithm malfunctioned, assigning thousands of individuals to northern capitals that possessed no digital record of their entry. The administrative machinery froze before the first physical transfers could occur. This technical breakdown triggered an immediate economic chain reaction across Western Europe. To avoid internal political instability, governments in the Netherlands, Belgium, and Austria chose to utilize the pact's financial opt-out mechanism, electing to pay the €20,000 penalty per rejected migrant rather than accept relocations. The mathematical consequence was an instant fiscal drain. By July 2026, the Dutch Treasury faced an unbudgeted deficit of €340 million dedicated solely to these non-compliance fines. This capital left national coffers at the exact moment domestic infrastructure required emergency funding, forcing central governments to reduce their direct subsidies to municipal districts. The financial crisis descended directly onto the lowest tier of local administration. In Germany, over 600 municipal councils declared structural deficits by mid-2026. The cost of maintaining integration facilities, language courses, and basic social care reached an annual €26 billion, absorbing up to 42% of local tax revenues. To balance their ledgers, industrial cities like Essen, Duisburg, and Dortmund deferred essential maintenance on public schools, halted local transport expansion, and closed municipal clinics. The countermeasure implemented by the federal government, allocating emergency block grants, only accelerated the distortion, shifting the financial burden to the federal debt registry and causing inflation in the urban construction sector as the state competed with private citizens for limited real estate. The physical space of Western European cities began to reflect this mathematical strain, as the inability to process applications within the mandated 6-month window created a legal vacuum. In Berlin and Paris, over 140,000 individuals whose asylum claims had been legally rejected remained physically present under a status known as tolerated stay. They could not legally work. Yet municipal authorities remained contractually obligated to provide emergency shelter and basic healthcare. This dynamic trapped thousands of people inside an underground economy, where untaxed labor drove down wages in the logistics and construction sectors by 12%, triggering an immediate, volatile confrontation with domestic labor unions. To contain the domestic backlash, Western capitals deployed a mechanism that broke the foundational pillar of European integration. They reinstated internal border controls. By July 2026, Germany, France, Austria, and Denmark had established permanent police checkpoints along their shared frontiers, effectively suspending the Schengen Agreement. The physical manifestation of this decision was immediate and severe. Cargo trucks moving along the vital Rhine-Alpine corridor faced average border delays of 45 minutes. For a just-in-time manufacturing economy like Germany's, which depends on automotive components crossing frontiers multiple times during assembly, these 45 minutes translated into an annual supply chain penalty of €4.2 billion, reducing industrial output and forcing manufacturing firms to lay off domestic workers. The social friction generated by these economic contractions rapidly altered security metrics across the continent. Data from Western European ministries of interior indicated a sharp drop in public trust in state institutions. In Sweden, areas designated by federal police as vulnerable zones grew to over 60 distinct sectors where parallel administrative systems eclipsed municipal authority. The state tried to resolve this security vacuum by increasing police budgets by 20%, but this funding diversion further starved integration programs. The result was an escalating feedback loop. Less integration fueled higher crime rates, which demanded more policing, which further depleted the integration budgets. The administrative attempts to execute deportations exposed the final, insurmountable bottleneck. Out of every 100 exit orders that French and German courts issued in early 2026, authorities physically executed only 15. Origin countries in North Africa and South Asia systematically refused to accept repatriation flights, demanding increased development aid or preferential trade quotas in exchange for compliance. The European Union attempted to use its trade leverage to force these nations to cooperate, but this strategy triggered an immediate counter-reaction. North African states threatened to suspend maritime border patrols entirely, a move that would immediately release hundreds of thousands of waiting transmigrants into the Mediterranean shipping lanes. By late August 2026, the entire architecture entered a state of structural paralysis. The central authority in Brussels could not enforce the financial penalties without triggering an absolute veto from defiant coalitions, nor could it suspend the pact without admitting total institutional failure. The Western capitals that designed the system could no longer afford its economic penalties, yet they could not survive the domestic political cost of accepting more relocations. The legal, fiscal, and physical mechanisms of European unity had worked against each other until they locked. The point of no return had been passed silently. The system remained upright, only because the external pressure had not yet delivered the final, inevitable push. By the summer of 2026, the structural fragmentation of the European continent has crystallized into a permanent economic and geopolitical reality. The suspension of the Schengen Agreement, initiated as a temporary containment measure, has institutionalized into a rigid network of internal barriers. Along the German, Austrian, and French-Italian frontiers, temporary concrete blockades have been replaced by permanent, automated customs terminals. The cost of this physical separation is no longer measured in delayed shipping minutes, but in a systemic drag on European competitiveness. Total intra-EU trade volumes have dropped by 4.8% in the second quarter of 2026 alone, stripping €96 billion from the collective gross domestic product. The borderless internal market, the foundational engine of the European project, has ceased to function. The fiscal consequence of this paralysis descends directly onto the European taxpayer. To sustain the deadlocked asylum architecture and offset the non-compliance fines detailed in the pact, Western European states have been forced to implement structural emergency taxes. In France and Belgium, municipal property taxes have risen by an average of 11.4% to fund the permanent operation of understaffed reception centres and legal processing apparatuses. The citizens of these nations are paying a direct financial penalty for a centralized policy that has failed to achieve its stated objective. Capital that previously flowed into regional infrastructure, educational development, and technological innovation has been permanently redirected into border fortification and social containment, leaving the Western economy structurally weaker against global competitors. This economic strain has triggered a severe geopolitical rupture along the Mediterranean axis. Sensing total abandonment by northern capitals that have sealed their borders, frontier states like Italy and Greece have begun deploying unilateral countermeasures. In May 2026, the Italian administration quietly initiated the issuance of regional temporary identification papers that grant transit rights within national territory, but violate the spirit of the new European Pact. This legal maneuver effectively funnels maritime arrivals directly toward the newly erected northern checkpoints, forcing neighboring states to deploy military personnel to secure internal borders. The European Union has fractured into three incompatible zones: a blockaded west, an unmanageable south, and a locked central eastern core. The primary beneficiaries of this structural breakdown are not political entities, but transnational criminal syndicates. The closure of legal transit routes and the failure of the automated relocation algorithm have transformed human smuggling into a highly institutionalized shadow economy. By June 2026, Europol estimated the annual revenue of these illicit networks at €6.7 billion, a figure that surpasses the total operational budget of Frontex, the European Border and Coast Guard Agency. These syndicates utilize sophisticated digital infrastructure and encrypted logistics networks to bypass state surveillance, establishing permanent, unregulated transit corridors through the Western Balkans and across the Mediterranean. External state actors have quickly capitalized on this internal vulnerability. The structural inability of the European Union to manage its demographic borders has turned migration into a highly effective weapon of hybrid warfare. Along the eastern frontiers of Poland and Lithuania, state-sponsored transit networks operated by foreign adversaries continue to direct thousands of individuals toward the European perimeter, forcing national defense ministries to divert infantry divisions from conventional deterrence to border security. The management of human movement has evolved from a humanitarian administration problem into an existential defense vulnerability that paralyzes the decision-making machinery of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. The administrative responses streaming from Brussels are fundamentally detached from the physical reality on the ground. The European Council's emergency summits in mid-2026 have yielded only one concrete proposal: the creation of externalized processing facilities in third countries, modeled after previous bilateral agreements with Albania. This strategy is structurally unviable. The proposed facilities possess a maximum planned capacity to process 45,000 individuals annually, while real-time arrival projections for the remainder of 2026 exceed 750,000. The solution is delayed by years and deficient by orders of magnitude. It functions as a bureaucratic cosmetic to mask an institutional void. The human cost of this systemic locking is borne by two distinct populations. Within Western European urban centers, second-generation immigrant communities face the economic consequences of strained municipal budgets, as funding for vocational training and linguistic integration disappears into security containment. Simultaneously, the asylum seekers themselves remain trapped inside an infinite loop of administrative detention, legal appeals, and physical confinement, stripped of economic agency and converted into statistical fuel for competing political factions. The moral authority that Western Europe attempted to project in 2015 has degenerated into a network of militarized holding camps and underground labor networks. Meanwhile, the geographical center of gravity has shifted. In Prague, the newly reinforced legislative architecture operates with absolute predictability. By refusing to integrate into the centralized European equation, Czechia has maintained an internal market characterized by a 6.2% neighborhood crime metric, a stable fiscal ledger, and an unfragmented social fabric. The country does not face the multi-billion euro industrial supply chain penalties paralyzing the Rhine-Alpine corridor because its internal logistics networks remain unimpeded. The political class in Western Europe can no longer dismiss this reality as a manifestation of historical paranoia. They are forced to observe it as a controlled baseline that proves the scale of their own structural miscalculation. The crisis has reached its terminal phase. The demographic, economic, and physical transformations that have occurred across the European continent over the past decade are mathematically irreversible. The structural mechanisms required to retroactively balance municipal budgets, dismantle parallel urban zones, or restore the seamless flow of the Schengen zone no longer exist within the European architecture. The central authority cannot compel obedience, and the sovereign states cannot afford compliance. The skyline of the continent did not change